I want to hear the questions people have. My concern is that
I really wonder how he.
my concern is that if I open up to commentary, then we're going to quickly go through. What's that? Yeah. There is.
So what's it say on the thing? Just go right there. That's right
Yeah, it sounds like there.
Yeah, it is really good. It's the best one I've had yet.
Very filling, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're filming people
Okay.
talking about their documentaries.
Perfect. Sweet. Good. Okay. Okay. So the only thing that is this we don't know is. So what was your?
Are you on recording?
Yeah, it's.
Oh, you're on your camera.
Yeah.
Yeah, were you talking about
No,
That's what I read to you.
Oh, I understand, but you've got it right here. That's where you're thinking about. Do you want to, so we're shooting right now?
Yes.
The panel will be hosted by Dominic.
Yeah, but I guess my question is, if you were to go in the other rooms, you can always say.
Yeah. I'll
Yeah, just chat.
Corvina is also affiliated with Searcher. On,
Jake, can you hear me?
I
Can
think
you hear me now, Jake?
Pike is the
Jake,
chair.
we're just doing a sound check, Jake.
Because
Can you
there's
hear me
two other
good?
people filming it too.
If I speak
So silly. Filming people talking about it.
We can have mics.
They only have
Okay. We should have mics coming.
Not everyone's professional enough to email ahead of time.
The smiles one?
So you're able to hear me?
The miles behind there.
Oh.
Yeah, over.
Okay.
Oh, Miles did tell me he I think the way he said it was he Michael Moored the Netflix crew that was filming like last year at the Board of Supervisors meeting. That he like actually did start filming them and then started asking them all these questions. Who are you guys? What are you
Is it
doing
gonna be on
here?
your lap, or are you gonna sit next to it, or what's your game plan? Just as it is right now?
Yeah.
I could, if it's okay, I can sit right next to it.
That's fine. Yeah.
Not your head, just like peek over.
Okay.
And I can have this in my box.
Good.
Yeah, what has this guy directed? Crime and murder.
Excuse me, Chrystal, I know you're gonna be on the panel. Emma, whoever is sitting with you here, just an FYI, this computer is gonna be picking up the live stream. And so Jake is filming this and conversations behind it will get picked up, just as a heads up. So there are no secrets.
You know,
I'm here to listen.
she's gonna be on the live stream.
So I think we're ready.
Yeah,
So
excellent.
from there, how do you put the pages?
All right.
You need us to be quiet right now.
Well,
It's
you never know when the road looks
Yeah.
rough.
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
So do you choose how you see things by page? Did you choose? Did you choose the format of how you see it in page?
Are you still working on your own personal page? That's still going. Not personal.
Okay, and then how do you make that one of your pages? Okay, you touch that and it turns into a page. So how do you get rid of it?
Or they didn't leave it on.
It's coming with these three icons. What does that do?
Was it a
On
stadium?
pages now. Arrow.
Oh,
What do those two things mean?
yeah.
It would be the
I want to share this.
industry with I can't remember the publisher, I'm sorry. He's going to be speaking here on campus, location and time to be determined, and maybe I'll have that information by the end of this panel. And then finally, I'm very excited about I'm excited about all of the events, but particularly the last one, May 2nd, Dr. Sue Sisley is going to be coming to HSU. She's with the Scottsdale Research Institute. She's going to be speaking in the Goodwin Forum as well at from 5 to 7 p.m. on her research on cannabis for treating PTSD. She's done a lot of really groundbreaking work with veterans. Google Sue Sisley and you'll see quite a bit of information about her. So that'll be coming out in May. So we've got a number of events coming out that I hope all of you can make it to. The topic of this panel has particular significance for this community. And before we begin, I think it's important to acknowledge that we have the privilege of being guests on native land. In particular, Humboldt State University is located on Wiyot land. And it's also important to remember that the tribal communities in this region have deep cultural and spiritual commitments to the stewardship of this land. And for these reasons, the focus of this panel is particularly relevant to understanding how we make sense of how we tell our stories about the relationship between people and the land. Before I introduce the panel, just down here, I'd like to just say a few things about how Q&A is going to work, as well as some last-minute weather-related adjustments to the panel. So if you have a question for the panel, you may notice on the screen behind the panel, I ask you to go to slido.com, and just this random code, event code came up, H420, I don't know how that happened. And that would be the event code for submitting questions for the panelists. Also, if you're not as tech savvy and you don't want to, or you don't have a device to do that, you can raise your hand and an index card and a pen will magically appear, and that could be submitted. What we want to do is we want to prioritize at this event questions from the audience and the panel's ability to answer those questions. And if we have time, we will open the floor up to comments from the audience. As far as weather-related changes, our moderator, who you see now on the big screen, Dominic Corva, is joining us via our wonderful internet connection we have here in Humboldt County from Seattle, as his plane couldn't land in Medford due to snow yesterday. And Ed Denson is home with the flu. So if you're watching this live stream, Ed, we hope that you're feeling better quickly. And Rio Anderson has valiantly agreed to step in literally less than 4 hours ago and drive up from southern Humboldt. Also, Tara Carver was called out of town to Sacramento, and so we have Chrystal Ortiz in her place. So some last minute adjustments to the panel. Now let me introduce our panel. Dr. Deidre Pike chairs Dr. Deidre Pike, right over here, chairs the journalism department and teaches writing, editing, advertising classes, and a new course called Humboldt and Popular Media. Deidre has a PhD in literature and environment from the University of Nevada, Reno. Deidre has been a newspaper reporter, editor, columnist, wine writer, mom, grandmother, pit bull lover, keeper of dahlia bulbs, and a lot of things, and amateur ceramicist. She's published 2 books, Media Literacy and EnviroTunes, Green Themes in Animated Cinema and Television. She came to Humboldt State University from the University of Hawaii at Manoa 7 years ago, and she's going to be here forever.
Alright.
Hank Sims, to her right, Deidre's right, is the editor and founder of the Lost Coast Outpost, an online local news publication based in Eureka. He holds a master's degree in interdisciplinary social sciences from Humboldt State and another from the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. His writing has appeared in numerous local and statewide publications, including the Anderson Valley Advertiser, the North Coast Journal, the East Bay Express, and the LA Times. He's a more or less lifelong resident of the Emerald Triangle, having grown up in the Mendocino County town of Willits at a time when the cannabis industry was in its first flower. I like that. His life experience with the topic at hand is vast, as he has, in his time, graduated from being a teenage wasteoid to a small-time grower to a small-time dealer to see if it's changed. to an amateur social theoretician on the local history of the cannabis industry, as well as occasionally journalist. To Deidre's left is Chrystal Ortiz, who is a local business owner and is active in the cannabis community. She previously worked as the operations manager at True Humboldt before leaving to take a full-time position at her own family farm in January of 18. She's an advocate for small sun-grown cannabis farmers and serves on the board of the International Cannabis Farmers Association. The mission of the organization is to empower traditional cannabis farmers for research, education, and advocacy. The board is made up of activists, cannabis farmers, and scientists with a strong vision. You can find out more about the organization at icfa.farm. And finally, I'd like you to introduce to our, oh, excuse me, to, I'm sorry,
Mr.
Rio. Where, I have, another page. Rio Anderson, to the left of Chrystal, is a lifelong community member of Humboldt County. He's a graduate of Humboldt State University with degrees in geography and economics, as well as having a minor in planning and interpretation. He's also a graduate of the Institute for Alternative Dispute Resolution and a staff member in the HSU Sociology Department. So we got to talk about that later. Rio was a 5-year member of the HSU track and cross-country team at HSU, and he's an economic development specialist with the County of Humboldt Planning Department, a cannabis farmer, and co-founder of the SoHum Guild. So our moderator on the big screen is Dr. Dominic Corva. He's a political geographer, founder and executive director of the Center for the Study of Cannabis and Social Policy, based out of Seattle, Washington. He holds a faculty associate appointment in the Department of Sociology at Humboldt State, and is co-editor. He is co-editor with me of the forthcoming Routledge Handbook of Interdisciplinary Cannabis Research. He is an affiliate researcher with HSU's Humboldt Institute for Interdisciplinary Marijuana Research, and he has published, taught, and organized on cannabis themes in the U.S. and abroad for the last 15 years, with previous appointments at Sarah Lawrence College and the University of Washington, Seattle. So thank you, Dominic, for agreeing to appear on the screen, although that wasn't the original plan. But I'm going to hand the proverbial mic over to you. So,
thank you, Josh. Thank you so much, and thank you for organizing this panel discussion. It's turned out to probably be more timely and of community interest than we anticipated. I want to start out by addressing the connection between the panel discussion and the thematic series it's a part of. And I want to do that out of respect to the thematic series on social justice, but also because it's been a question I've been getting from journalists who've contacted me, asking me about the panel discussion. And I want to be fairly brief and not too academic about it. My background is, in fact, studying global social movements, and I kind of came to Humboldt in 2008, 2009, kind of looking for what happened to the 60s. And I found a lot of folks who were willing and able to talk to me about that. And along the way, began to learn quite a bit about the cannabis industry and Humboldt as a place that's been really shaped by cannabis prohibition and markets. And so my response to that question for the journalist who asked, it started out really by saying that the social justice themes and issues we have today can be traced directly to the social movements of the 1960s in particular. The anti-war movement and the civil rights movement maybe being the two most prominent ones off the top of your head that you might be able to associate with. And of course, I choose those two because also those are two social movements that were explicitly targeted when Richard Nixon launched his first efforts of the war on drugs in 1968. I just want to read a very brief quote from former Nixon aide John Ehrlichman on the origins of the war on drugs. This was an interview with Dan Baum in The Atlantic a while back. He said, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. former Dixon domestic policy chief John Ehrlichman told Harper's writer Dan Baum for the April cover story published Tuesday. I'm not sure what year actually. Just copied and pasted this. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, Ehrlichman said. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. And so this is a quote that speaks directly to hippies and cannabis and more broadly their connection to the left. But it also says something about the role of media representations in creating essentially domestic enemies or others against which the rest of society must be protected. And so the Humboldt variation certainly emerges after a short period of time as a new theater in both that disruption of those communities and the new social justice initiatives that they were pursuing, the anti-nuclear war movement and increasingly environmental justice movement. And by drawing attention to the fact that those annual camp raids were especially useful as domestic propaganda on the evening news. It was very important to propagate a certain representation through mainstream media about these folks and why they were no good, really. A lot has happened since then, and I don't mean at all to say that these exact conditions are the exact same ones we have now, but I think it's interesting to trace those continuities over time. I think that the current hubbub around Murder Mountain as a series really kind of revolves around the issue of representation, especially representations that are now national and global, and maybe some policy implications from everyone hearing that maybe Humboldt is where everyone's on meth and murdering people. This isn't to say that there isn't a lot of truth in the series. It's about really what the series focuses on in terms of its representation of Humboldt and its communities. And to be fair to the documentarian, certainly chapter 2 in the series does focus, I think, more on the history of Humboldt and the foundations of the cannabis industry. But what I'm hearing, and again, I don't want to represent the community, are a lot of different kinds of representations of that community that aren't exclusively about essentially murder and vigilantism. And so I think that what's going to be important here for this panel is to allow space for the panelists and the audience to discuss those representations, because they have a material effect on your lives. I don't know that there's a direct connection at this point, of course, but it wasn't that long ago, just a week or two ago, that Governor Gavin Newsom decided to reorient the National Guard from the border, which he said was a manufacturing crisis, up to Northern California, with kind of a broad implication about Humboldt obviously being a key part of Northern California to combat illegal grows. I'm not saying they're connected, but I'm saying the representations that say this is what cannabis looks like in Humboldt County may make it more palatable to the rest of California to say that's a good idea. Let's go ahead and resurrect essentially militarized policing. So I think there's direct policy implications. I think that there's representational issues that aren't necessarily, but could include distortions or false representations, but certainly shining a particular light on a corner of the truth doesn't necessarily give us the whole house and the light in it. And so this is an opportunity to consider that and look at that. So with that said, with the help, especially the help of Tara Carver, actually, who was really actively engaged and really wanted to be here and expresses her apologies for not being here, we came up with 3 fairly broad questions to open the night to the panelists. And we'd like all the panelists to take a stab at addressing one by one on the 3 questions, and then go from there to audience questions. Now, Josh, I have a slight logistical issue with not having the questions up on this screen. If you gave me a moment, I could pull it up, or do you have those more easily available to you right now?
I've got them right here.
All right. Do you want to go ahead and read out that first question, and then we'll let the panelists take them, and we'll start down there with Hank. And it's no accident that we have two journalists on this panel, because we're dealing with essentially, media representations. And it's important for those people with that expertise to address those. And the first question really is about that. Josh, can you ask that question, please?
Yeah, the first question is, how do you think local press coverage has shaped public perception of the cannabis industry?
Oh, there we go. How do I think local press coverage has shaped impressions of cannabis? Was that?
Oh, it is on.
There we go. Okay, I just gotta hold it up. How do I think local press coverage has shaped? I think this is a bit different than the question I remember, but honestly, I don't think local press coverage in Humboldt County is aimed at Humboldt County people. And I don't think that, especially in this day and age when things are not as mediated as they used to be, I don't think that local press coverage affects local perceptions of the cannabis industry that much. I think Humboldt County is small enough that everybody has firsthand or secondhand at least knowledge of what the industry is all about. I would think, yeah.
Swap out the mics.
Oh, all right. Is it better? Are we on?
Yeah.
Okay. I was talking to people today about the time when the Eureka Times Standard used to put the weed cutout on the cover all the time. When I moved here, the Eureka Times Standard had a marijuana leaf cut out, a graphic element, and it was on. You guys probably remember, it was on the paper a lot. It was there. Can you hear me? It was there all the time, and we were talking about the design gift that was to the paper, because people pick up certain kinds of things, and they pick that up. So here in Humboldt County, and we kind of miss it. I haven't seen the weed leaf on the paper for a long time. But I think I'm going to go with Hank on that local coverage doesn't do too much to shape our opinion of the weed industry. My students were telling me about various TV shows where they get a Humboldt reference. I teach a course called Humboldt and Popular Media. And the students will find in random things from Orange is the New Black has a Humboldt character, of course, that teaches yoga and grew weed here. And I can't remember, there was another show that a girl just watched, and they were picking plants in the forest, and the girl says, "This reminds me of my time in Humboldt." So it was, I think that kind of coverage, I think Murder Mountain's been huge, and we're gonna talk more about that. I get calls from all over the place about Murder Mountain, my family members in various parts of the country, and people, I taught in Reno for a while. People from Reno want to know, what's up with that show, what I think of it, etc. So that larger aspect, I think, shapes us quite a bit.
Hello, can you hear me? So as a local resident and someone who is impacted by the local press on cannabis, I would disagree with both of your perspectives on that. And local opinions and local press has shaped the worldview of the people who live here in an ability to create discord or to create discontent or to create a feeling of the haves and the have-nots, or to build on this divide amongst our community. More because cannabis was often in the crime section. And the cannabis leaf on the cover sold newspapers. And Jack from the McKinleyville Press, I remember talking to him directly and him saying, "Chrystal, if I put a pot leaf on the front page of the McKinleyville Press, I'll sell all of them." It just is what happens. And so when the representation in the press over and over and over is negative and is cannabis in the crime section, and I would bet if we went back through the last 20 years of press clippings of cannabis on the cover in any of our local press or local newspapers, we would be hard pressed to find any positive representation of the cannabis community or of cannabis as a medicinal plant in general. And so I think that locally, the local press has had a responsibility or a perspective, I guess I shouldn't say that word, has had an impact in the way that our community relates one side or the other. And instead of creating a system of cohesion where, like Hank said, every one of us we're not one person away from the cannabis culture or cannabis community in this county, instead of finding a way to bridge our likeness, it has built on the fact that we are different and that what we do for our kids is different than what they do for their kids or what our jobs are compared to what their jobs are. And I'm glad to see that changing, and it has been changing. But I think that local press should recognize that you do know that you do shape culture and you do impact culture. And locally, the cannabis being only in the crime part of the newspaper has had an impact on our culture.
Yeah, I would agree as well. It's hard to live in a bubble in Southern Humboldt and hear a story that has no real reality based on my life. And so I live in this bubble where I'm really into permaculture. I'm really into working outside. I really have intentions with my life that are a lot to do with kind of the founding of that community. And then to hear the constant feedback loop of negativity and the crime, which was real, and I'm not saying it wasn't real, and it needed to be dealt with, but it didn't bring people into a conversation. It only allowed people to cast judgment on each other, at least in my view. So I think it does shape the discourse between the cannabis community, which is a part of this community, and the people that aren't in the cannabis community.
So let me go ahead and ask that question and take out the word local, because we had actually kind of originally done that. But have you been getting a sense that perhaps Murder Mountain and coverage that is like that shape the public perception outside of Humboldt, California? It may or may not be helpful for you. So what does it matter what other people think outside of Humboldt County about Humboldt County when it comes to media representations? And give examples if you can.
Well, I would say that, yeah, I would say that, yes, definitely Murder Mountain has shaped, and stories like it have shaped perception of Humboldt County outside of Humboldt County. My wife, who has relatives in Los Angeles, got calls after the show's like, oh my God, are you okay up there? Are you going to, everybody's getting stabbed.
Hold it closer.
Okay, there we go. Okay, yeah. Okay.
Much closer.
Okay. So yes, definitely, like I would say, like outside of Humboldt County, that these are the stories that people hear about Humboldt County. Does it affect Humboldt County? Certainly it does. I would imagine. I know that people in the marijuana industry in particular are sort of sometimes facing a backlash. They face sort of competition from industry in Oakland, in other places, saying that growing outdoors, growing in Humboldt County is unsafe. There have been stories that I've seen in the wake of Murder Mountain saying like, what your blood cannabis, that your cannabis is watered with the blood, and things like that, definitely. And Humboldt County as a whole, like outside of the marijuana industry, like it shapes perception of Humboldt County. So certainly those things do have an effect. Yeah.
I feel like we could go back and forth, and you guys could address that perhaps, and then
You want me to?
yeah, would you? That'd be great.
Sure. So in 2016, and Rio has had tons of positive press too, so we can kind of share a little bit of those stories. But in 2016, somebody was coming through Humboldt County from NPR, and they were looking for somewhere to camp. It was midsummer, and there was no camping in the Avenue of the Giants. And so my farm was on the Avenue of the Giants. I said, why don't you just camp at my farm? You'll be fine, I promise. And so he came through to do some story on, I don't know what his story was, but when he came through, he camped at my farm. It turned out that the California report then became simply about his experience on my farm and how different it was than what he expected. and eating spaghetti at the table with the kids in the field and how beautiful it was. And when that aired, it was international, it was a California report, NPR. I got call after call after call of friends from all around the world, my more intellectual friends that listen to NPR, about how they wanted to come. They wanted to visit. They wanted to see us, how proud they were. When Murder Mountain aired, I got dozens and dozens of calls. Are you okay? Oh my God, I don't think you should be there. You know, are you sure you're okay? And so while Murder Mountain had such a broader reach because it was Netflix and it was, you know, Murder Mountain, both of those stories showed me an interaction. And of course, Humboldt is in plenty of popular media all over about Humboldt this, Humboldt that, always relating to cannabis culture. Oftentimes the stoner kind of white boy perspective image is usually what is portrayed behind that. And so I think that the perception of media and of Humboldt County is kind of current. It's shaped with what they hear, what they see right then, and then it will kind of go away into the, you know, into the background and become Humboldt and cannabis again. You know, so.
Well, I'm glad that you were there for the California report. So that's awesome. And certainly, I think that's a great example of how culture is shaping our storytelling. It shapes our culture, and there's a feedback loop of shaping going on. So people see your story in the California report, Chrystal's story, which is positive and good, and they have a positive, good image about us. It's kind of obvious. And Murder Mountain scares the bejeepers out of them, and they worry about our safety and our personal well-being. So there's a George Gerber quote that he who tells the stories doesn't need to worry about who makes the laws. So I think the ultimate takeaway from some of this is that our view of Humboldt and the outside view of Humboldt becomes a legal problem for us. And in this, you know, in the case of Gavin Newsom ordering folks up here, is it possible that this was related to the scary danger of Murder Mountain or other kinds of media representations that people hear about, and they, wow, it's lawless outlaw culture up there, we need to fix that. So there's a lot of takeaway for that on the impact of the cultural storytelling. So that's, I mean, what I do is look at the narratives in these texts and examine them for what kind of impact they have on the way we really see ourselves, and then on the outcome in the laws and how we treat each other, and tourism even, for that matter.
Which is what I was going to address. The week following Murder Mountain's release, I'm on the board of the Southern Humboldt Business and Visitors Bureau. We had 4,000 hits on our Instagram page or one of our social media networks of people looking into the Elevate the Magic campaign. And that's a total positive view of Humboldt, about really nature-based, elevating the magic of what is Humboldt. And so for every media sensation, there's also, people are gonna wanna seek out the real story, I think. So, I mean, they say no media is bad media. I think that, you know, people wanna seek out additional information. So I don't see it all as bad, but I agree that the story is more important than anything. And the fact that we haven't done a good job of telling our own story, especially the founding generation of Southern Humboldt, we haven't really shied away from telling the world about what I mean, there was a 6-year period in Southern Humboldt where nobody worried about money. We all met at the river every day. Everything was peaceful. I used to run around town, riding my bike, wouldn't come home till after dark. It was like an exceptional moment in history. And it's like the Wild Wild West was only a few years, right? There was like those few years of Southern Humboldt kind of still define a moment in time, which we're all trying to get back to. So that story hasn't been told.
Rio, for the sake of the audience, which 6 years were those?
75 to 82, maybe right before the drug wars started. Maybe a few years into the drug wars, because we still all got away with it.
So let me have one last follow-up to this question, which is, I mean, obviously there are news cycles and some things, you know, enter the popular imagination and stay there for a little bit and then they go away and then the next story gets told. But can any of you think of any examples of press coverage that you would recommend to folks as a, you know, balance or complement or counter narrative to Murder Mountain? Can any of you think of examples off the top of your head of kinds of press coverage that has maybe offered a different kind of shaping of public perception?
Well, I would say, I wouldn't say press coverage, but the first thing that occurs to me is Gentry Anders's excellent book on Southern Humboldt.
Gentry?
Whose name, like, what is the name of the
Beyond Counterculture, Gentry's book?
Beyond Counterculture, yes, that's a fantastic book that is, describes, I think, the period, both that Rio talked about and then the period right after. It's a wonderful book. I'm sure you can get it in the HSU library.
Anybody else?
I'm gonna actually jump in. The HSU library just received last semester, I don't know if it's publicly accessible, I could get in trouble for saying this, but we were just gifted a copy of the Chronic Freedom series. So if you don't know anything about what that is, just look it up, Chronic Freedom series. That's an amazing documentation of the history of cannabis and counterculture movements in Humboldt County.
Yeah, artist Scott Holmquist's work. Sorry, go ahead, Chrystal.
I was just gonna say, you know, I don't know, in our culture, press wasn't really where we told our story. And, you know, it was kind of those who know don't talk, and those who talk don't know. So if you want to really see where our story was told positively, you look at our community radio station, you look at our community center, you look at our fire departments, you look at our public schools out in the hills of Southern Humboldt. And that's where you're going to see the positive stories and the leftovers of that days gone by.
And currently, with marketing and cannabis, like the constraints of the new reality for cannabis farmers, those of us that are trying to be as compliant and follow the rules are also marketing, and we're really promoting a whole new farming model of regenerative farming. Claire, who's videoing today, has been making a movie about the regenerative cannabis farm movement, and it's sinking carbon into the soil, it's agroforestry, it's doing all the environmental good that was the true intentions of that community. But we didn't really take hold until the market kind of asked for that, which is funny because through the years, you know, like there was a huge indoor boom down there because that's what the market wanted. That went away and everybody did greenhouses in the outdoor because that was what was viable economically. So the socioeconomic constraints created these waves, but the current wave is that if you're a regenerative farm and you produce super good cannabis in an environmentally friendly way, you can sell it much easier. So that's happening, and that should get as much press coverage as possible. Yeah,
I'm reminded by your answer, actually, of the answer that I gave the reporter who asked me last week of alternative kinds of ways that I guess Humboldt is getting projected. And, I said definitely the branding and marketing of the licensed farmers that are, you know, associated exactly with that sort of thing is one of the ways those narratives will be coming out, which is interesting, the branding stories. And then I also wanted to raise the existence of the Humboldt Area People's Archive, on the board of which Douglas Furr sits. Douglas Furr was invited to be on this panel. He's out of town. He's featured extensively as the smuggler in Chapter 2. And so for folks interested, the Humboldt Area People's Archive is another good spot. So our next question follows pretty easily from the first one, because it now asks the panelists, do you think Murder Mountain was an accurate depiction, in part or in whole, of the cannabis industry? And this gives you an opportunity to discuss what's accurate about it, what may not be accurate to you, or what may be partial to you. And I'm going to allow each of you to obviously answer to your strengths in that regard. Let's start with Hank.
Well, I think that Murder Mountain, I ended up liking it quite a bit more than I thought I would when I watched the whole thing. I do think it was an accurate I have no reason to doubt that it was an accurate telling of the story of Garrett Rodriguez. The problems come, and this is where I think speaking of representation comes in. The problems come, I think, in the way that it tries to set the Garrett Rodriguez story and its aftermath into a sort of wider context of Humboldt County and the cannabis industry. There, I think it makes a few stretches that aren't warranted, and that the filmmakers kind of, I think, knew to be not warranted, but played up because it helped sell the story. But as a story of Garrett Rodriguez and it's a story of the marijuana industry as a whole, going back to that time in episode 2 when Mr. Burr and his friends were naked building houses in the hills. I think that the filmmakers did make an effort to try to place that particular period, 2013, 2014, when the events of the Garrett Rodriguez case took place, into a wider timeline of marijuana in Humboldt County. I think they made an effort, a good faith effort in certain ways, but I think they really fell short in other ways, talking about it. And I can talk about those more, but I don't want to talk. We need to talk.
You don't want to I don't know. I have absolutely no clue whether it was accurate or not. I don't know much about Humboldt, Southern Humboldt. I've lived up in Northern Humboldt, and I've been here for 7 years. So that I can't speak to, but I can speak to some of what I saw going on in that story that they tell. And it was the story of Garrett Rodriguez and this Ocean Beach kid who comes up here, a young man, and loses his life. But as Hank's pointed out in other venues, West Coast Outpost, it's become a missing person story that is representative of all the other missing person stories, of which there aren't really as many as we've heard. And you can speak to that better than I can. The story seemed to me to be predicated on that act of violence as an indicator of all the violence up here. And it demonized, I thought, the marijuana industry. I don't think that I've seen in the 7 years I've been here that kind of violence, and it certainly isn't coming from marijuana, which is, as far as I know, not creating that kind of a culture. It almost felt like at times it was that reefer madness kind of narrative, and people were raging demon weed. Was it the first episode where they were recounting serial killers and on the loose, murder, oh no! And then we have the vigilante justice coming around in episode 4, and so we have the violence begets violence concept going on. The vigilantes are responding to a vacuum in law enforcement, and they go out and solve the issue. They take matters into their own hands. And the narrative shows this in a way that makes me applaud. As the audience, I kind of have to applaud their moxie for going out and finding Garrett Rodriguez's body. I think you could read that narrative in other ways, but it seemed like that's what the story wanted me to do. And I did, because I'm a mom and I have kids, and I would want my son's murder to be resolved, and I would want to know where his body was. So I appreciated the vigilante justice, and yet there it is, violence again being created through all of these, through this narrative, and me kind of feeling pretty good about it, and then feeling pretty angry toward Humboldt County Sheriff's Department. Is this all accurate? Well, the Sheriff's Department puts out a press release and says, no, it's not. And the family of Garrett Rodriguez, who's still fighting for justice for Garrett, is still fighting that, and actually sent an email, I think, to all the panel. Did you guys get the an email from the family, asking for some nod to a little Garrett Rodriguez. So has not the murder's not solved. So I think the story did a good job, or the 6 episodes did a great job of pointing that out, bringing some light on those topics. And but I wasn't sure how to feel about the violent solutions to the problems. That's my take on it. But I don't know if it's accurate. You guys can tell me more about it.
Well, I have lived here in Northern Humboldt for the last 20 years. So I don't have, I didn't know Garrett Rodriguez. I don't have a connection to the community in Alder Point or Rancho Sequoia, to many of the people that were on the film. I think the only one reason why Cannabis and Murder Mountain are combined together are because of prohibition. And, while we look at law enforcement as the problem there, it is clear that law enforcement did not follow up in the way that we would have wanted them to in that community, but that community doesn't depend on law enforcement for a reason. And the unjust laws are the reason why that community doesn't depend on law enforcement in the first place. And so if we had been able to remove cannabis component from the criminal pages in the press and the criminal side of law enforcement, then we wouldn't have this vigilante culture in the way that we do in Southern Humboldt and in Northern Humboldt and cannabis culture in general. I don't relate to the culture in the show any more than anyone else from Humboldt County. I think we have more in common as Humboldt County residents than we do in the cannabis culture with those people. And I did also have empathy for Garrett's family, and even though there aren't as many unsolved murders or missing people as is portrayed, there are too many. And I think one of the best things about where we are today, headed into regulated cannabis and moving cannabis out of hopefully state and federal law, is that we will be able to not have that conversation anymore, and that people who are comfortable and law-abiding citizens, and when there's violent crime in their neighborhood, they're going to feel comfortable calling law enforcement. And as a child from this era, I do not feel comfortable calling law enforcement very often either. So I think that's really the only, one of my famous quotes you guys have probably heard, some of you have heard me say, is that cannabis culture is like the DMV. Everyone is represented. And so it crosses all socioeconomic boundaries, it crosses all cultural boundaries, and the cannabis culture is woven through all of us. So I can't really speak too much on Garrett and Alder Point, Rancho Sequoia as the cannabis culture, but I can in the vigilante and the need for, even if you were someone who was not involved negatively, you wouldn't feel comfortable speaking to law enforcement or calling law enforcement. It's just part of the culture.
I grew weed in Rancho Sequoia for a friend of mine in 1984. I think I was like a freshman in high school. And Rapid Ron and Mean Gene lived on a bridge. And we would run out and open hatches. They're Vietnam vets, and we would open hatches, like metal hatches in the ground. They build foxholes, and they put their plants down in the foxhole, and then close the hatch for light down in the early 80s. Point being is the planning department that's like the smallest parcels in Southern Humboldt. And so if you don't have a lot of money and you want to grow cannabis, and the barriers to entry to be a cannabis grower has always been very low compared to other parts of society. And so if you didn't have any money and you wanted to get out of poverty, Rancho Sequoia was a good place to go. And that's what's missing from the film, is Southern Humboldt as a reflection of the rest of America. Like, people come to Southern Humboldt to make money for a reason. It's better to move to Rancho Sequoia than to work for a corporation in Bakersfield. You know what I mean? Like, that story didn't get told. And also the inference, I think the movie did a bad job of inferring the spooky community. Like the eerie fog in Garberville. It's not foggy in Garberville. It's sunny.
I would say too, just if I may, Dominic, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I think that my issue with the way that was portrayed is, if is through the missing persons and unsolved other unsolved cases that they talked about. In those cases, I think the filmmakers do very well. One of them, they went out on a search and rescue mission with technical rescue people. That was for Hannah Hammers, who had nothing to do with the marijuana industry whatsoever. The other person, who's, I don't know, she was at petroleum. I'm not gonna say she had nothing to do with the marijuana industry whatsoever. Her disappearance had nothing to do with the marijuana industry whatsoever. And the other person they talk to a lot is the person from Australia, the mother who comes and looks for her daughter, who actually went missing in Mendocino County in Point Arena, not even relatively close here, and there's no tie to the marijuana industry in that case either. The filmmakers knew this, that the fact that they didn't explain this in the film is distressing and disturbing, and the fact that they talk about almost high rate of missing persons reports, which are very different than missing people as we think of them and as the film portrays them.
And I don't know if this was in the film, but I know a lot of the people in the film, and they're customers at our store in town. A lot of those, the people that were part of the leaders of the people that committed the murders were from the Midwest and weren't like integrated into the community. So they weren't really community members, whereas the old vet, John, who is the guy that kind of connected with Garrett's father, he's been a part of the community. And so there's that divide too, because people, like I said, move to Southern Humboldt for easy money, and it's been like that. I don't think it's like that now, luckily. They can all go away. And the people that really want to work and be part of a community can stay. That's how I feel. But we've had a migration of people coming from all over the country to make money.
The timeline was also distressing. I forgot to talk about that. The way that the film was laid out, it kind of like, episode 1 and 2, and then Doug Fir and that, kind of idyllic style leading down into this dark and foggy, into the depths of despair, which is where we are now. I think there's, elements of truth to that, but the timeline, I think, was really inappropriate and didn't really show the truth of our community.
So let me actually ask you to speculate a little bit. I think that one thing I'm hearing from you is that while it's important to show respect and give space and compassion to people who have had people go missing from their lives, that it's how that story was arranged, essentially, and the narrative, the way it was composed, that may have made it a little more difficult to kind of see or understand how Humboldt County has been a place where people get lost on purpose, which I think might have been a term I'm borrowing from Hank Sims. But like the rest of the United States, it's a place that people go missing. I think that's a little difficult. I actually wanted to say that right at the very beginning, there's an interesting, I just want to draw your attention to it. Right at the beginning, the whole setup to this is Garrett Rodriguez's father is telling him as a young man that he's got a property for him and he just needs to build a house on it. So go make that money as soon as you can. The sooner you make it, the sooner you're going to have a house. And he tried the fishing boat shortly, and then he went to Humboldt County. And there's I think a broader societal interest or critique to be had about the kind of stress that we're putting on people, and the ways in which they find the cannabis industry in Humboldt County to be a place to solve those particular kinds of issues, of lack of availability of good jobs and resources. I think that these questions actually, which again, Tara Carver really is responsible for authoring mostly, they go together so well, because what you're getting at here gets to this third question that is set out fairly plainly. How would you define the culture of the cannabis industry in Humboldt? And before you guys jump in, I just want to note that one of the things you're pointing out here is that it's different in different places, and it'd be a good idea to contextualize those different places, Rancho Sequoia, for the purposes of Murder Mountain, why is it different, or perhaps is different from the rest of Humboldt County in terms of the industry and the culture? But I'm just going to open that up. How would you define the culture of the cannabis industry in Humboldt? Hank?
Well, I always get to go first.
And hold that mic real close to your mouth, please.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. I don't think it's wrong to say, the last 2 years have been different than the previous 45 in the Humboldt County marijuana industry. Or in the Emerald Triangle marijuana industry generally. And I don't think it's wrong exactly to say that the Humboldt County marijuana industry over that period, and which is now rapidly changing, I don't think it's wrong to say that it's been an outlaw culture. And there's a point in the film where one fellow says, like, I'm an outlaw, I'm not a criminal. The laws that I don't agree with, I don't follow. And it's maybe like to find a distinction, but I would guess that, like, the Humboldt County marijuana industry, like Humboldt County generally, since 1860, has been an outlaw culture. It's a place for people to get away from the world at large. And in the late 60s, people came up here. They left Haight-Ashbury or Berkeley and came up here and tried to build a new life. And the outlaw culture in that time was different. The people then didn't want what capitalism was offering them, and they tried to build new ways of life. They ended up finding out that an unjust law, marijuana prohibition, that they were able to make a living off because of this unjust law. And I think that, so they're outlaws in that sense. They didn't believe that prohibition was just. They felt that morally justified in growing marijuana to feed their families. And back then, it wasn't much more than feeding your families and paying your mortgage. Things started to change a little bit, I think, around 1996, when Proposition 215 passed, and the gray area of the law ended up changing it a little bit, changing the culture a little bit. I think that there was a time then in 1996, people came to Humboldt County not to build a different way of life, not because they didn't want what capitalism was offering them, but because they wanted what capitalism was offering them, and they wanted to get it as quickly as possible. That's more what I call not outlaw so much, but criminal. And there are certain strains in the marijuana industry today, as depicted in the film by the sort of the guy with the bandana, maybe, he's a strange and dubious fellow. There's certain strains in Humboldt County certain strains in the Humboldt County marijuana scene, the Emerald Triangle marijuana scene, maybe dating from that time in 1996 when things opened up to people, the green rush, people flooding in to make a bunch of cash to buy nice things for themselves. There's a strain that knows that the law was unjust, but wanted to remain because it let them have a sort of franchise over the production of marijuana. It let them maintain their position. People going legal now. Nowadays things are changing. People like Rio, like Chrystal, are working and to be part, to get beyond the unjustness of prohibition. Yeah. But there are people still, and these people are hopefully maybe dying out, who want to act as if things haven't changed. The fellow with the bandana says, like, I'm an outlaw. I don't agree. I don't conform to laws I don't agree with. Well, what laws are those in this day and age? It's not marijuana production. People can legally produce marijuana. It seems to be, judging from the state of his grow, at least as depicted, environmental laws that he doesn't agree with. Or licensing laws, or having to pay taxes or some such. That's my overview, I guess.
That's kind of a lot to follow. I can't remember the question.
How would you define the culture of the cannabis industry in Humboldt?
Oh, right. That's not something I know much about except for secondhand. And what I know secondhand is that people who want to continue in a business that they've been doing for a long period of time have a difficult entry barrier to that through licensing that seems to make things a little out of reach for folks. So I feel like people who want to make a living doing this now are faced with that. I'm going to be illegal or I'm going to be broke. I don't know, but I mean, that's one of the narratives of Murder Mountain. It's something I hear from neighbors. It's something I hear from students here at Humboldt State University and folks in the community where my kids go to school. So I think it's gotten kind of hard for Humboldt. I know also my artist friends are out of work because no one's buying their art anymore. There's a whole lot of ways this is playing out in our community. We don't have as much money. So I think that's going to impact everybody. It could impact this university. You guys are going to know more about this than me, however. Why don't you take a stab at it?
Thank you, Deidre.
They got me. A lot of what Hank said, there are components of it that are true. There are components of it where, yeah, you know, outlaws, criminals, I think a lot of the last 20 years has really changed that from the outlaw kind of, this is an unjust law, to a economic situation and decision. At the same time, the decision to join corporate cannabis and to go legal and to jump through red hoops as if you are growing uranium on your property, or to give up your water rights, or to do all of these things that we are forced to do as small property owners is still unjust. And so a shout out to my elders and to the community members who have not chosen to take that step. I feel like Rio and I were on the forefront of taking that step. And to this day, if you ask me this morning if I feel a sense of responsibility to my community members and I look around and see them struggling and suffering, I do not think the step has been that good of a step. And so it doesn't have any, I mean, I'm doing it. I think we should do it. I think it's beautiful that we have an opportunity to grow cannabis and to do permaculture and to move into that world. But I beg to differ that it is, there is still a lot of reasons why there are people who are not choosing to take that step. And they're not criminal people. They are holding it down for a value set and holding it down for a natural life and natural laws that they feel like they should be entitled to on their property and in their homesteads. And so I think it is a lot of us, a lot of people were not just bucking law, we were bucking a system, a taxation system that supports war, a taxation system that supports things we don't believe in. And it's not that easy now to justify your decisions when you are now jumping through hoops and hoops, flaming hoops of barbed wire that get smaller the further you get into them, simply for your decision to grow a plant. And many of our community members are bankrupting themselves in the process. And when I look at them now, it is hard to say, spend your last $50,000 on this dream. It might be easier to save that last $50,000 because you're going to need it. And so I think it's really important that we have empathy and we recognize, as with the National Guard conversation and with the other stuff, that our community does not need the National Guard. We do not, it terrorizes the children. What now we're protecting money and business interests instead of protecting people from this demon plant. Is it any different? I'm not sure. So I think that there are components of what Hank said about cannabis culture that have changed, but I also think that there are people who didn't just want to grow weed, they wanted to live a life that was outside of this, and fingerprints and no water rights and all of this stuff. It's really important that we look at this
Being from the community, and that's what we call it, the community, I've never been another place where I can point out all the people I know in the audience, and there's an unspoken empathy and connection that I have with those people, and it doesn't exist for me in other places. But maybe that's because I'm from there. So the socioeconomic requirements over time have kind of defined behavior, for sure. Like Rancho Sequoia, I don't know when that murder took place, but 2013. I mean, the behavior that was required to succeed in Rancho Sequoia at that time was you needed to protect your scene, you needed to defend your space, you needed to stay clandestine. You know, that was the requirements. And throughout the evolution of the pot industry, the community has changed its behavior. I did a presentation for Rotary down there and said the behavior for the new cannabis legal market is you need to be outgoing, you need to reach out and make connections, you need to be branding, you need to be connected. You're the middleman from Ohio that sells your weed in the Midwest is not it was your old business partner, and your engineer and your planner, that's your new business partner. Like, it's all different, and it just requires different behavior. But the people and the intentions behind a lifestyle of living in a natural area is like unmet for me. Like, I've tried to work I did environmental planning at a computer for 8 hours a day, and I hated it. It's like saving the environment by sitting in front of a computer. I would way rather try to do permaculture, be in nature. And that's what I really want to see cannabis culture evolve to, is like, I don't want corporations to come in here and bring those values into Humboldt and then have to like subscribe to that industrial model. We're trying to build not an industry, a community where people are supported to live a lifestyle, not a lifestyle to support an industry. And maybe it can't be done, but we'll see.
Thank you, Rio. I want to take two little forks in that question real quick. One of them is to take the word industry out of this and try to focus a little more on the culture side of things. And what that means to me is really, what are the values of the community that you have in common, and how might they be different in different parts of Humboldt County? You touched on a little bit, but I'd like, especially the last two of you there, to address what are those values exactly that define the cannabis culture that you want to be a part of and that you want to stay in Humboldt County.
We did a values conference in Southern Humboldt where we brought 140 members of the community into the Mateel, and we did a 3-day process where we expressed our personal values, and then we, which all I learned at the sociology department at Humboldt through and Cascadia. We tagged all their values up on a board. We did value mapping, clustering, and then redefining those values, and we came up with 8 essential values of the community. And they were things like that the nature sustains us, and we live in that region because of our spiritual connection to nature. That everyone, that we've been a place for refugees from other economies, and that we will continue to stay welcome for people to come into our community and live and make a life.
There was outlaw culture. That was like an
There was,
embrace of our outlaw culture.
Embracing how we're different and how we don't want to subscribe to, the modern culture, but we want to define ourselves and our own culture. There was 8 of them. I can't remember them all. We keep posting them on Facebook all the time. But I think that the cannabis industry has evolved. It's not, when I'm referring to it, it's a lot of, those are the values of the community that's down there. But we have, in Arcata community of And there's a lot of our entrepreneurs and doing things up here. And there's a lot of wonderful people doing extraction and businesses. And, so I don't, there's a few institutions like HCGA and ICFA, and we're doing the SoHum Guild that bring us together to exchange our conversations and values. But it's a little more varying now that, there are varying corporations and investment companies. There's so many different players in the cannabis industry, but it's not really a community as much as it's Southern Humboldt.
I do have the values here, but I wanted to just kind of briefly kind of segue that. When we were an outlaw culture, it was clear as a community who our enemies were. The enemy to our lifestyle was the system. The enemies were the cops. The enemies were corporate America. And now that's not so clear. And that's really confusing on the inside to see, to just try to figure out who is with us and who's against us. Who are we for and who are we not for? And is it cool that we're corporate? Is it not cool that we're corporate? It's really, it's a lot harder to define us in the same way that I think it was before. But I attended the Values Conference. It was really beautiful and it was super diverse. There were some very wily SoHum characters there. And so depending on what table you sat at and how I came to, there was just really strong personalities, which is what I love about Southern Humboldt. And so the values were that we came up to all together throughout this 8 to 10 hour process. It was a pretty major process. Was the land sustain us spiritually and we honor nature's cycles. We treat everyone with respect, compassion, and empathy, regardless of their capabilities, acknowledging that everyone is born with pure spirit. We acknowledge the value of respecting common needs of all people, regardless of their circumstances. Community institutions in a way that incorporated awareness, education, volunteerism, and intergenerational cooperation. The Southern Humboldt community provided fertile soil for the artists to grow amongst nature. Arts and music are a crucial part of our blond and playfulness in SoHum. We respect and value the beauty of our unique ecosystem, our stewards of healthy watersheds, forests, and wildlife. Southern Humboldt collaborates to provide the sufficient resources for the health and well-being of our entire community. We aspire to work towards mutual respect and promote integrity, equality, and diversity by breaking down social and economic barriers. And it's imperative that we, in a positive way, accommodate the continuing evolution of counterculture so that refugees are integrated in a way that respects human rights in existing communities while cultivating wellness, personal growth, generosity, accountability, and honesty. Obviously, that's kind of skewed because it was a group of people who would show up to a values conference. But I think that as a business owner, from a member perspective, it's really important to highlight what those values are and to figure them out so that you can check yourself and see if you're living amongst the values that you set for yourself. And so I found it a really profound exercise, was really appreciative for it, and in turn went back to my corporate structure that I was building at that time, integrated values into my corporate structure. And so I think that it'd be awesome to do that as a community here. It's pretty clear that cannabis culture was very present in that room in Southern Humboldt when we created those values. So that's kind of as close as I can get to cannabis culture in general.
I see a sequel or an episode 7 for Josh Zeman, Values on Murder Mountain, or Values Mountain. I don't know, something like that. I love it. I appreciate what you guys are doing, and your care and attention to the environment is particularly important. I think that's the one thing that I felt legalization could bring would be the just a restoration of some environmental values. I know that folks grow weed. I live near Blue Lake, and there's a lot of runoff into the Mad River. It's quite polluted, and I'd love to see a legalization, a marijuana culture. My value would be as is yours as a permaculture. And to see folks embracing that in a way that they could also grow would be fabulous.
I can address that.
Yes.
Quick.
Go ahead, Brett.
Like that runoff?
It's education. It's a community, right? So people, like I said, 2013 Murder Mountain, you had a certain set of skills to survive. And now we're so slow to really teach those skills because we're still a divided community. I mean, the Measure S budget for where they're spending that 20 million is not coming back to the communities that money's coming from. So where's the re-education? Where is the training? Where is leaders that want to help all my friends in Murder Mountain that helped me in 1984? Like, when are we gonna solve issues and get to that? It's gonna be it needs to stop being, the way the agencies treat us, it's still like we're outlaws. Like the DFW tax, for if you have a slide on your property, you're charged $5,000, and that's a holdover from when you were a criminal. But now they've rolled it into the new thing. So if you're a cannabis grower, if you're not a cannabis landowner and you have a slide, you don't get that fee. But if you're a cannabis grower on land, you get a $5,000 fee just because you grow cannabis. So the modern culture has to change if we're going to change and solve those issues.
So before I take the next cork real quick, I just want to ask, what's different about Rancho Sequoia, if anything, from, let's be specific here, from Whale Gulch or Salmon Creek or Avenue of the Giants? Is there something different culturally? Does it have like an economic basis? Is there,
Well, it's socioeconomic. They're the smallest parcels that were subdivided, so their barrier to entry to buy one of those parcels is lower. If you look in Trinity County, you have Trinity Pines. You're going to hear that in the news. Same thing. They're small parcels that were subdivided and a lot more concentration of people, a lot closer, and they were accessible. And over the last 20 years, I wasn't there in the 80s growing weed in Rancho Sequoia or Alder Point, but as someone who did know, I wouldn't have bought a property in Rancho Sequoia or Alder Point in the last 20 years because I know, that the cultural, connection in that community, not to hurt them because I'm sure they have beautiful cultural connection, but is not the same as Salmon Creek or Whale Gulch or Honeydew or somewhere else where you were to find a parcel. But the parcels in those other places were much larger and much more expensive, and the people around them were much more affluent and able to purchase them, and so they weren't really available to us. And as you get your community more affluent, typically environmental standards increase, cultural standards increase, what kids want, what people want for their children, what kind of schools they want to go to. That changes. So we're talking about socioeconomics, I think, is the main difference.
Yeah, I was definitely begging that answer for that question. Because what I'm hearing here is that, part of what's being broadcast in terms of representation about Humboldt County is a place where there's more concentrated rural poverty, perhaps, than other places, that's less educated and so forth. With really, if you use the jargon of the present, it's the least gentrified, perhaps, rural area in Southern Humboldt. And so my question really is that how do you engage and integrate these culturally differential places when you've got, in particular, this common kind of environmental stewardship value that seems to come with wanting to stay here and be here for a long time and raise your family here? How do you do this without basically telling them, too bad, go away, we don't want you here?
You got to listen to them. Nobody's been out there except for police. So the only, I'm not sure, but I assume, and I think that that's true, is like, when's the last time we did a community action plan for murder, for Rancho Sequoia? Like, when's the last time we engaged? Like, there's just not any community process. So there's leaders out there. There's people that want to help. There's branded companies out there. You know, Palo Verde is right next door, and they have leaders that are developing. You know, Heartwood Institute moved in there, and that's become the center focus. And they don't. I mean, it's a little bit of a different socioeconomic thing, but just like any poverty situation, if you just leave them on their own, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. You have to address and engage people and find solutions.
I don't know if it was JFK, this quote, I'm going to misquote somebody right now, but I think it was that you can't adequately protect the interests of the rich without providing a safety net for the poor. And I think that there's been huge economic disparity. I spent the last 17 years raising my kids on the backside of Pequon across on Johnson's Bar in Yurok country. And, you know, this is probably not the most appropriate forum to say that you could almost pick any mountain in Humboldt County and name it Murder Mountain and figure out the murders that went down in there in general throughout history, because this is an outlaw place and because we are really far in the rugged Pacific Northwest. But when you talk about socioeconomic injustice and you talk about how can you adequately help them, I hope that the removal of prohibition of cannabis is going to help them. And one of our biggest hopes through the Measure S taxes, our biggest hopes through those of us who walked through the door first and said, enough is enough with this criminal culture, enough is enough with this environmental degradation. Our hope was that in removing the criminal aspect of just cultivating cannabis, that we would be able to reach out to those children, to those schools, and to those socioeconomic places with funding, where a rising tide raises all ships were some of our things that we said together, and the hopes that we had. And I hate to feel doom and gloom at this point. It doesn't feel very much like that is a reality at this point. But we are in a change right now, and Humboldt County is going to change really drastically in the next few years. I don't know how it's going to turn, but I do feel like the commercial cannabis production is going to leave this region, and it couldn't happen any sooner, really. And the return to values-driven and permaculture and regenerative and branded and stepping forward and showing ourselves is the best hope we've got. And if we can do that and we can pull it off, hopefully we can now reach out to those communities with funding and figure out how we can make sure that those people get the education they need, get the nutrition they need, and get their roads and their culverts and the access to the world that they need. That's the hope that we have that we've been burning through this regulated cannabis world.
That's an excellent plan. I like the Southern Humboldt tourism campaign, Embrace the Magic. Elevate the map. Of course, I apologize. I should remember that. I should write it down. I love Elevate the Magic. I love Alice in Wonderland dancing through the forest, and I thought it was fabulous. And the folks in Shelter Cove on the beach is wonderful too. I had this strange idea that could help up there, but I'm not sure. It just might just be something weird. One of my colleagues said, Murder Mountain, you could have a theme park. You could have, leaving San Francisco, a billboard that says, Murder Mountain, 222 miles. Okay, the access is really bad to get to Alder Point. The roads are horrible. If you've ever driven up there, it's gnarly and scary. But perhaps
on the county's portion.
On the county's portion.
Not the cannabis growers' portion.
Right, yeah. So, roads could be improved. You could build a memorial to Garrett Rodriguez based on the fact Rio said that any press is good press when you said how many hits that Southern Humboldt tourism. So now my little PR brain goes to work and thinks, well, maybe you could turn the Murder Mountain into kind of
I heard you could get stickers almost to Murder Mountain at Confusion Hill. I'm not sure, but I've heard that the Confusion Hill gift shop has some Murder Mountain stickers. This could be a rumor.
You have already in place some farms, and I know that you do farm tours in southern Humboldt. So you could do education and permaculture, the touring kind of thing, and improve that situation, train folks to do permaculture, and then show others how to do it up on in Sequoia, Rancho Sequoia. Sell t-shirts. I smoked a joint.
Can I ask the photographer who's blocking my view of the panel to please move? I can't. I'm talking. Thank you. Sorry.
It's an idea. It seems like it would demystify kind of the culture of the scary outlaw part of the culture, and maybe honor the good outlaw part of the culture. Can I even say that? The good outlaw part of the culture?
Well, I think that if the value of our cannabis is 10 times the value of commodity cannabis, your neighbors are going to look and they're going to start figuring it out. What did they do? Oh, well, they're doing regenerative practices. They're doing rainwater catchment. They're doing organic. They have this branding package. And if the demand for our cannabis is higher and the price is higher, it's automatically going to affect the neighbors around. I mean, that's how, vineyard, we're the only culture where for some reason, if your neighbor's doing good, you hate your neighbor. And Humboldt County is the only place where national parks don't want people camping in the park, or where you get mad that your neighbor goes to Hawaii or has a nice truck. Most people are happy to be around that affluence and know that that affluence is going to, the nicer their neighborhood gets, the better it will reflect them. So hopefully the value of our cannabis as a permaculture, regenerative, if we can get that message to the masses and there becomes a demand for that cannabis, we can create change in that way too.
I think the show did a good job of enhancing your brand. I don't know if you felt like that.
The Murder Mountain brand, the appellation of Murder Mountain.
No, the Humboldt brand.
Oh, the
Because they
Humboldt
mentioned
brand.
it so many times.
Yeah, they did. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to describe that, like the branding part of this is fully connected to the value building part of this for economic reasons. It's theoretical at this point, for sure. Like, I can't tell you whether regenerative cannabis is going to be worth 10 times as much as non-regenerative cannabis. That's going to be, a hypothesis that will be answered by your, how well you guys manage to market it. That's not going to be easy. But with that said, I think that we've spent about an hour on these 3 questions, and that it would be good to begin to get some questions from the audience and give the panelists a little chance to interact with the audience, and let's see if we can get out. First, we're going to take questions. We will, if there's time, take more extended comments as, on a case-by-case basis. And Josh will be in communication with me about those. But for this part of it, I'm going to need, Josh in the room to be able to go ahead and read out those questions. Thank you, Josh.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a reminder, if you came in late, many of you folks out there in wherever in the world have submitted questions. We've got probably 70 questions I've been trying to mill through, some that aren't actually questions. But and if you don't want to submit a question online, raise your hand. If you haven't already, make sure you get an index card. There are people in the room who will bring you an index card with pens. Just raise your hand high and make sure I get it. Excuse me. I need to set this down. I'm gonna ask I think a tough question that we've reflected on in terms of thinking about. I mean, part of the goals of this panel was to talk about representation of a county, of a history. And, I think this is a good question. I know we've wrestled with it, Dominic and I. But somebody asked, do you think the Southern Humboldt weed industry was able to thrive and be relatively protected because it is predominantly white? And there's been a number of questions that have asked about certainly the representation of the panel that we pulled together. Much like the Murder Mountain film, it's hard to, pull together a panel that can fully speak to the county, can fully speak to the media. media has an interest in the county. And so I'm going to throw out I think a tough question right there, if anybody wants to grab that.
I think if I don't know that the Humboldt County marijuana industry was so protected as that. I think that the powers that be went after it as hard as they could with the resources they had at the time. It's just that because we're a crinkly county that's easy to hide. It's the reason why the industry flourished here. That being said, I would guess if the industry weren't so white, that more resources would have been found likely back then in the 70s that were allowed.
Yeah, I think it's obvious that the discrepancy in sentencing between white culture and black and brown culture is it's just science. You can't really debate that. That yes, this culture here was gone after by the National Guard. I don't know that the National Guard went into underprivileged cities in the crack epidemic. I'm not sure that happened at that time. Law enforcement did and has, but the sentencing disparity, unless you were picked up federally, obviously locally we're going to have a local jury. It's going to be predominantly white. We're going to have local law enforcement. I think that bigger risks were taken here because the culture was predominantly white. Yes, so that would be my opinion.
Growing up down there, I had a weird sense of racism because the only black people I knew were Rastas, and like friends, so it didn't make any sense to me. And there wasn't like a striving to get ahead. So nobody was, everybody had a job and nobody wanted a job. Right? So there wasn't this like classism thing. And so going out and doing sports and seeing how other cultures and race relations and coming here to Humboldt, it was trippy for me. But I'm just throwing that out there that racism, it wasn't, it was weird to see it from the back end for me. And I don't know, like, if I was president, I certainly wouldn't go after black people.
As a daughter of a Puerto Rican man who was black and brownish in northern Mendocino in the late 60s or in the late 70s and 60s, we were the brownest people around that we knew of. And aside from Jim Jones, who was a neighboring parcel, and his Guyanese people that were there. And so after leaving the golden era that he talked about from the 70s to 82, my family did not survive the camp wars in 82 intact, and my mom escaped with her kids somewhere else, and I didn't come back until I was grown from college. Or from high school, and at that time when I did come back, it had been 15 years or 14 years since I'd been in Mendocino. I stopped at the Napa to get windshield wipers put on, and the guy at the Napa, just by looking at me, knew that I was my dad's daughter. And so I think that race does play a role. I think that Rio's perspective was true. Kids that were raised to love everyone didn't have racism, but I think that race has played a part in the drug war from day one.
I was on the phone with someone from outside of here, and they said, "You got a lot of white people up there." And I said, "Yes, we do, and a lot in the documentary. Indeed, the Murder Mountain was very white, but there was a person who wasn't, and that was Garrett Rodriguez. I wondered, and I've wondered that for a while now since I watched the documentary, if things had been different, if he were a white kid, or if his last name wasn't Rodriguez." If the Humboldt County Sheriffs would have done something differently, instead of telling his parents basically that, or his family that he's just an outlaw and he's going to be suffering the fate of that, basically, which is what they were apparently told.
I can say that throughout the cannabis industry, we have people from all over the world that work for us. And so there really isn't a racist tone to the cannabis industry. At least, we've had people from all over the world that worked for us and lived with us and, watch our children when we go to town. So I don't know if that's in pockets, might be different, but the overall tone and history of it has been very interracial and intercultural.
I'm gonna
Go ahead.
I'm gonna shift gears. Very different question. And this is actually directed at you, Chrystal. Since it's now fully legal, are you supportive of law enforcement now since the unjust laws were removed? And there were some other questions that were really about, are you supportive of law enforcement coming in and trying to eliminate the black market?
Absolutely not. I don't think that law enforcement eliminating the black market is the approach. I don't have anything else to say about that. Do I support law enforcement and the enforcement of laws? Of course. But do I think that using law enforcement as an attack on the unregulated or the traditional market at this point? No, unless it is strictly towards environmental crimes or, and in that case, I would like to see those environmental crimes be enforced across industry and across the board if that is the way that we're going to go. And so I would like to see a more, I'm kind of extreme in my views, and a lot of people don't share these same views, but I would like to see cannabis regulated like lettuce. And so in that term, I feel like anyone who wants to walk through that door should be able to walk through that door. And if they can prove that they have the environmental awareness and that they have the water and they have the storage and they have the things they need, I think that the barriers to entry should be as easy as walking in the door and filling out a piece of paper and expressing your interest. And so I think if we did that, then we wouldn't need law enforcement at all to deal with cannabis regulation. People don't agree with me.
Right.
Rio, do you want to speak to that at all?
I think that the new laws haven't allowed for access to enough people. And so the idea is that if you're compliant, you're doing the right thing. If you're not compliant, you're not doing the right thing. It can't be justified because they made it so difficult and so expensive and so tedious and so political that by this time, even the people that thought they knew everything are having a hard time. So what about Murder Mountain? Like, how many farms are compliant up there? In a, you know, if you can't go after people that are in that lower economic bracket that are having a hard time coming into compliance. You have to do, unless you're going to go in there and give them multiple opportunities. People are people. You can't just throw laws at people and can't help them get through that. So we,
Just throw one thing in there as well. That same logic also applies to the inner city. And the stigma against, I think, mostly people of color who do not have ownership, retail ownership of the legal cannabis industry and couldn't possibly, not even close. So I think that there's a sort of a class issue here that expresses itself probably racially in Humboldt with the poor whites, but also the poor people of color in the inner city whose livelihoods are being taken away from them by corporations, by men and so forth. I think that the laws that have been passed are absolutely ignorant to the problems that gave rise to them in the first place. And I think it's disingenuous to say that being legal, state legal in California is legal, because even that, it's not. You're federally a criminal still. So like from a federal perspective, from other states, they could turn around and stigmatize, totally legal, licensed, compliant operators the same way folks who haven't been given the opportunity, I think, to pass those barriers in California are.
Bill de Blasio was on late night TV talking about how he wants to pass laws that don't exclude the people that were most affected by cannabis or that were traditionally in the cannabis market. And other politicians are saying the same thing. It's like, how do we take the communities, because we're a refugee economy from the rest of the economy. So people that didn't want to get involved or couldn't get involved in certain economic sectors or economic wealth could get ahead or find a life in cannabis. And now investment companies and corporate structures that you can run at a loss for 4 years, and you're going to put all those traditional people out of business. So there are laws, and there's other states that are looking at how to integrate those communities, and it is unjust to exclude them.
But Rio, can I ask, that's different. What the vision that you just described is very different than saying we want to regulate cannabis like lettuce, which Chrystal was talking about. Those are two very different things. And it points, because as we know, corporations grow lettuce as well. We get better lettuce on the plaza in the summer, or at Chautauqua. But to say, what I wonder is sometimes about, like, as a county, how we struggle with the sort of fact that the industry, that the culture that we describe growing up here in Southern Humboldt, other areas of the Emerald Triangle, I think it never would have existed as it did had prohibition, had there been no prohibition. We never would have had an industry of people living off the land, going on 40 acres of land, mountainous land in Rancho Sequoia or elsewhere. We never would have had that culture or that industry had prohibition never existed. That the industry would have gone to the Central Valley or to Washington State or Oregon or places that people could grow at a profit. When we talk about prohibition, it's not just the victims of prohibition are the cultivators. The victims of prohibition, as Chrystal was talking about, are the consumers as well. And for a long time, when you talk about like having to arrange a regulatory system that allows for people, that gives the franchise to people who have been outlaws in the past, or restrict the franchise of those people. Aren't you saying in a sort of similar way that, like, the government gave us price support all these years by shipping a certain percentage of our number off to prison, and we need the government to continue to support our prices going forward by not allowing anybody larger than us to grow it at a lower price?
I see what you're saying. My answer is that the barriers to entry to get into the legal market are too high for people that were in the traditional market. The idea that we're going to make money on cannabis might just disappear. So if it's just like lettuce, I've never bought cannabis in my life. I would never buy cannabis. It just seems silly to me. Every time I go to my friend's house, there's a huge bowl of it on the table. So the idea that, and I think we're an ideal people. Like, I'm willing to give up the cannabis industry if it's, if we can create another industry or live by the values that we espouse. I mean, that's the whole point, is we settled in a place and developed a set of values that then cannabis allowed to live. But I will say that everyone that I know that talks about Southern Humboldt from down there idealizes the first few years when we had no money.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to losing more money and getting back to like being more clear-minded.
Yeah, I think they were just as against the back to landers when they didn't have cannabis on their property.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's not a very fair point, in terms of that's the only reason why this culture's here, or the only reason why, obviously, the price supports a prohibition. No one can deny that. There's price supports a prohibition. But in my perspective of regulate cannabis like lettuce, the barriers to entry to grow lettuce are pretty low. If you want to grow lettuce in a garden in Oakland and you have access to it, and you can grow this lettuce that's Oakland grown, and you can market it that way, and you can find a consumer, it's available. And that's what I mean by regulate cannabis like lettuce. I would like to see corporate agribusiness regulated out of existence in the same way. But not because it's a plant, but because I would like to see more values placed on the type of cultivation, the type of gardening that we could do and could have as a community. But just for like a small bit of perspective, in the last 20 years, you've seen grape production really increase, right? In California, all the way through Baja. I was just in Baja last week with my kids. And as the grape production increased by a lot, the price of grapes in Sonoma and Napa did not go down. And so, and in fact, in many cases, it went up. And so as we differentiate our marketplace and as we create these consumers, hopefully, and we educate them and we get this story out, there is a potential that by growing less and using less resources and doing less to the planet, we can get more value out of it. And so that is like, and like I said, it's kind of the only hope that we really have in this case. And the fact that many of us who live on our homesteads probably aren't going to go anywhere anyways. And so, it just is what it is. We're going to be resourceful and figure it out. But I really think that the idea that we need prohibition to support and prop up the pricing, I don't think that's a fair.
Just as we historically did. I mean, I have family. I grew up in northern Mendocino County. I grew up in this world. Yeah. And there was, there came a time. Yeah, people. Like Rio said, those years were poor years. People got older though. The people who moved up there as 18, 19, 20-year-olds in 1972, they got older, and it gets harder to live poor when you're that age, when you have children that you want to buy clothes for. And people still did live poor in that age, in those days for a long time. Yeah, I really do see sort of 1996 and Prop 215 as a sort of dividing line. But people did have to feed, to buy food, and this became the way that people did that because you could get $3,500, I don't know what it was at that time, $3,500 a pound in that day, and you get $3,500 a pound because prohibition existed. You cannot, even today when prohibition still kind of exists and the barriers to entry into the market are there that you're talking about, nobody's getting $3,500 a pound or $5,000 a pound.
That was branding and marketing of OG Kush.
I don't know about that. I mean, that there. I think I saw.
I mean,
I
prices
remember,
were $1,500 in the 70s.
Well, in 1992, I can say with a great deal of authority that before, I think before OG Kush existed,
Yeah.
you could get 5,000 a pound in the city. Nobody does that anymore, and without prohibition, you wouldn't have had that. I mean, what I think is that what you guys are doing is really, really inspiring, and it's taking the best, taking the best approach. I do agree that there will always be a market for premium pot in Humboldt County, from Humboldt County to people and people who do it with care. But you do have to, I think we do have to sort of be honest with ourselves that for those prices to exist and for families being able to pay to feed. For people being able to feed their families by growing 50 plants in the yard under manzanita bushes that were carefully trimmed to hide things from the air, that you needed prohibition as part of.
Oh, I totally agree. And what we're trying to do is evolve the culture.
Yeah.
So we know that prohibition is gone. We know that those price supports don't exist. That other areas, the new reality is that other areas are producing much more than we are per farm. We wish that we still have the most permits and we're a productive region. But we know that overproduction is going to bring price down in basic economics. What I'm interested in, and I think in the big scheme of things, like those cannabis served a purpose for that time. I'd say it lost its purpose like 20 years ago. And it was time. We've been so invaded by green rushers and the environmental damage and the negative externalities of that culture in the last few years that it was time to stop it anyway. And we need to come up with what's next. Like what is the plan for a bunch of rural land dwellers to live in a forest and participate in town and have a thriving economy? We're working on that every day down there.
Poppies.
Maybe. Craft farming.
So I spoke with the film director last week. I had invited Josh Seaman, the director of Murder Mountain, to come out here. I didn't realize he was in New York. And we had a long conversation, and I asked him to share with me what he thought the point of his documentary was, because he was concerned that it was misunderstood. And one of the things he said, and I think this is important, he said that he wanted to communicate that the violence that ended Garrett Rodriguez's life was a product of cannabis prohibition. And he was concerned that the focus became so much on cannabis and not the broader context in terms of policy, in terms of law, in terms of the institutions that regulate this plant. And so it's interesting to hear what the panel is discussing in terms of speculating on the potential impact of if we didn't have prohibition, for example. Before I get to the next question, I just want to make a brief announcement. One of our panelists, Ed Denson, who couldn't be here, as I said earlier, is going to be hosting a talk show tomorrow on KMUD 88.1 FM at 7 p.m. And he'll be answering questions, the same questions that were asked of this panel, and giving his reaction to the discussion we're having here tonight. So that's just an FYI, you might want to check that out. If I can jump to a different type of question that has been alluded to, and it's not so much necessarily around representation in Murder Mountain, but it has come up, and I think it's important to acknowledge. Somebody asked, this is from online, what about grows happening on public lands, and are grow practices that are harmful to the environment? Are such practices representative of this community? And specifically, I believe the person is asking about the cannabis community.
No, but it exists because there's an opportunity there. So people go, whoever goes out there, the majority of people that live here would never do that because they have other opportunities. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it's we as a dialogue in our community despise those practices, and they're super harmful.
Let me jump in and just ask a follow-up, if I may, because it dovetails here. And there's, as I said, there's a lot of questions that have come in, and a lot pertain to the environment. Somebody else asked, how is the cannabis industry, I imagine locally, of course, caring for the environment, and what things are they doing to help not leave a carbon footprint?
On behalf of the International Cannabis Farmers Association, I will say that promoting sun-grown cannabis practices and reminding these regulators in their ivory towers, in their corporate offices, that prohibition light, aka mandating commercial indoor cultivation in desert areas and in other areas in the state of California, does not match our values as California and as global citizens, and that promoting sun-grown cannabis practices it should be in the forefront of what we're doing, and promoting small farms and small property owners to be able to stay on their land and reduce their carbon footprint by using on-farm inputs, and increasing that and showing the world that's our values as California is what we should be doing. And that the whole world is rushing to regulate cannabis right now, and the majority of places where they're regulating cannabis, they're doing indoor, energy intensive, and really energy intensive practices. And I think that when one of our ways that we can help with global warming is to nourish and care for our soil and bank the carbon where it's supposed to be. And when you nourish the microbial life in your soil, and you cultivate any sort of garden on your property and encourage that microbial life there, you are doing your part, your independent part, to solve global warming, and even faster than stopping us driving vehicles and all of these other things. If every person on the planet had tended to a piece of land we would see tremendous value in that.
In our tourism talks, we like to say that people will come here for our cannabis, but they'll leave fascinated by our practices. So we've done this for corporate partners and insider industry people, and they come because of our reputation and our cannabis, but then we show how we're sinking carbon, and we show the soil, how we converted dirt into soil, and they're fascinated by it. I mean, it's an ideal, just sharing those practices is a fascinating scientific and cultural fun thing.
I guess I have a little interjection because I was thinking about the lettuce and regulation. And I know that some people don't grow lettuce the same way as other people grow lettuce. And they use a lot of crap on their lettuce and they spray it with stuff. And how can we, I mean, it's not my turn to ask a question, but how do you regulate that as a community if there are people that you don't know who are doing bad things? Is that
Well, cannabis testing standards in the regulated market are the highest testing standards of any plant on the planet Earth. And so, I mean, there are products that have grown, they do cannabis covered chocolate blueberries, and they've had to pull them off the market because even every organic blueberry that they found can't pass the testing standards that happen, that are mandated once you mix it with chocolate. So, you know, if we maintain the highest testing standards, which I think is a no-brainer for me, and I think that as a cannabis industry, we can keep leaning on that. And testing standards are, quality standards and testing standards are the way we're going to preserve our culture.
And it's really hard to do that without a balanced ecosystem. So we're not set up for scale and industrial farming, but we're super well set up for agroforestry and having a balanced ecosystem where all the pests aren't just attacking one thing, that there's trap plants, there's barrier plants, you can do so many natural remedies to not have pests. Pests want to eat greenery, and if the only greenery is tilled soil and lettuce, they're just going to attack the lettuce.
I just wanted to add that you can find information at regenerativecannabisfarming.org if you want to see some positive examples. I made some videos, one of Chrystal's farm for Cannabis Now magazine. So if you Google Cannabis Now High Water Farm, you'll see an explainer video with really awesome imagery of what she's doing dry farming, which uses no carbon footprint whatsoever. It's pretty amazing, so check it out.
And actually, I've raised the topic with somebody actually in the fisheries department here at HSU about conversations with, I don't know where it's going to go, this large aquaculture project that's coming to Samoa. How that could be utilized with the local cannabis industry, because there are practical applications there because of aquaculture. I want to, because just in the interest of time, I do have a question though, another one from online that maybe is a good one for us to close with. Somebody points out that there will be more large budget productions coming that deal with the same topic. What can we do to ensure that these future projects portray us accurately?
Well, oh, here, it's my turn. I don't think you can ever ensure people portray you properly. I was interviewed by folks for this, and you double check and you try to say things clearly to people, and folks are still representing you when you give them your story. So that's hard. I think it would be awesome to recruit people to do some good videos, to do more of what you did for Cannabis Now, get Chrystal's farm